Hi, this is Steve Hargadon. Welcome to EdTech Live. This interview with Larry Augustin was recorded on Friday, October 27th, 2006. For more recorded interviews on educational technology and free and open source software in education, please visit www.edtechlive.com or my blog at www.stevehargadon.com.
Steve, how are you this morning?
I'm good. Did you remember I was calling?
Yes, I did.
Oh, good.
In fact, I have on my screen right in front of me now your blog entry on your recent interview with Richard Stallman.
Oh, good. That will give us some material.
Of course, I've known Richard. I guess known is a strong word. I mean, we interact occasionally for many years now. My first meeting with Stallman was, or my first interaction with him was when I was working on a piece of software called Bison++. I had taken the GNU parser generator, of course, from the Free Software Foundation, and modified it to work with C++. Richard was actually asking people to take it down from their websites because he had various issues with C++ and the fact that there were sort of two pieces of software as opposed to rolling it all into the Bison framework. But anyway, that was kind of my first interaction with Richard. He was asking FTP sites to take down software that I had written.
Interesting. Well, did you actually get a chance to read that blog entry?
Only a bit. I know, certainly I know Richard's stand on free versus open source.
He was very particular about it.
I know. He's very focused on that brand. My view has been always that, my understanding is that, he uses free software to refer specifically to software licensed under the GPL, right? And I use open source to refer to software under the GPL and a broader set of licenses. I think it's that while I believe the GPL is something like 60% of the software released on SourceForge today, there's still a pretty darn big world of software that's under other licenses that I would consider fairly open. That give people the principles to reuse, fork, modify, redistribute, all of those freedoms that the GPL also gives them. So I prefer to think of the larger ecosystem.
Yeah, it's been very interesting. I've tried to ask as I've interviewed since Richard, and I also interviewed Eric Raymond prior to interviewing Richard. And both were very unique, just interviews, just in their own. But then I've asked people afterwards, and pretty much everybody that I've talked to since then ends up defaulting to open source and doesn't feel the same deep philosophical drive that Richard does. With at least within the educational world, if there's understanding of open source software or free and open source software, it's really called open source. It's almost never called free software. Right.
And I agree with that. And I spend most of my time in what I would call the commercial software world today, right? Or more specifically, the commercial open source world. But I almost think of that as a unnecessary modifier, because part of the reason we use the term open source is we want to embrace commercial efforts as well as free efforts, where free means in that instance free as in beer, right? So anyway, I just and the other thing is I'm very comfortable if people want to call it free and open source. I'm not religious about the name. What's important to me is that people are working with the code. It is open. People have the rights to modify, redistribute, reuse, fix things themselves. I mean, I love the feeling of empowerment you get from having the code. And so if it's happened to be called free software versus open source, I'm not as religious about the terminology.
I think that Richard accurately, or I would say is realistically concerned that there are people or organizations who will look to co-opt the idea and still keep things proprietary, but with the impression of openness. And certainly I see some of that in the open technologies kind of movement.
Oh, I agree. That is definitely a risk. In fact, there are plenty of examples of companies that have tried to or will attempt to sort of claim their open source when in fact, they have a sort of free for non-commercial use or limited trial or, some other variation on things that is not truly open source, is not blessed by the OSI. We have to police those things. And I think it's important for people to know the distinction. So,
and I would say that part of what it took me a long time to get the interview with Richard. It didn't take a lot of time, but it was over a period of time of emailing back and forth with him and his requirements and making sure that I used I was going to use the phrase free software only in the interview, and then making sure that it was going to be displayed in a venue that didn't compromise his perceptions.
I have a funny RMS story. I was at a lecture over at Stanford. This is a couple of years ago now. They run these computer systems lab lectures, and the speaker was in there. I think it was the GNU Radio project, which is a set of software for modulating voice and effectively becoming a broadcast station, right? And the speaker is talking, and at one point the person says, and it runs on a variety of Linux systems. And from the back left-hand corner of the audience, I hear this voice yell out, "It's GNU Linux." And I'm sitting at the other end of the auditorium, and I thought, what's Richard doing here? I said, there can only be one person that in the midst of a lecture would yell that out at the lecture. And sure enough, I looked back in the corner there, and this was out at Stanford, and, I guess he had been in town, and he came by to see that lecture, and he corrected the speaker on stage there. It's GNU Linux. Anyway.
It is very interesting for me because I come from a non-software background and also come from a non-open source or free and open source software background. But I did appreciate the passion that he brings to it. I've sold computer hardware for years, kind of fell into this role of open source software for schools. But there is a very noticeable difference for me when I talk to people with regard to their overall perception of, and this is going to sound really general, but there does seem to be a difference in perception of business and of life philosophy that I can detect between those who really have a commitment to the free and open source movement and those who seem to be using the phrase or the term in order to be a part of the financial movement moving forward. And I don't know if I've expressed that very well, but I did appreciate what Richard brought to the dialogue because I noticed that the commitment to the freedoms and the openness really is a distinguishing factor.
Well, and Richard, the thing I give Richard credit for is, first of all, he launched, our understanding of this, movement. It wouldn't be here without him. So immense credit there. But he is, as you say, very passionate and very unwavering in his position. And that, I think, is, that I admire immensely. I mean, he is, he stays the course. You always know where Richard stands on the subject, right? There is no doubt he is consistent there. He is focused. He understands, the message, and he has the passion for that. And I admire all of those things.
it was very funny to interview him because even till the last few minutes of the interview, I had to be careful about everything I said, not just saying free software, but even the way that I described an entry in Wikipedia. I think I said content. And he said, you can't use the word. I mean, he corrected me every step of the interview. He's a very exacting person and very determined to use words in an exact way.
Exactly. Yep.
Well, I've started recording. And with your permission, I'll actually give a little intro to the interview, but I'll just keep us moving forward.
Great.
The interview series is intended to provide those who are in educational institutions, typically K through 12, with a basic understanding of free and open source software, and to give some flavor and perspective, as we have definitely seen an increased trend in interest in free and open source software, and a desire to figure it out and to find out how to implement it in schools. And I think it might be helpful if you gave a short overview of your own personal history and your association with software, because most people are probably not going to be familiar with you.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So I began, so my background is an engineer by training, undergraduate at Notre Dame and PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford. Spent most of my time working on software there, even though a lot of my focus was in hardware, and I did hardware design and hardware verification languages and built chips and things like that. I did it very much from the software development side. Spent a lot of time developing compilers and tools and such. And that's where I got my first exposure to free software. This is probably 1986, 1988 or so, when I began using most of the Free Software Foundation GNU tools to develop code that I was working on. And it was interesting, by the early 90s, say 1990 to 1992, everything we did would use free software as the basis to build on. And I think this is a really fascinating part of the story for me, because being at an academic institution, and I had transitioned into a research role, research staff role at Stanford by about 92, 93. We could get mostly anything we wanted in terms of software for free, as in no dollars, right? But the best software was actually the software that we downloaded off the internet for free, and free is in FSF free, GPL licensed. And that's what we used to build most of our code. So I worked as a system administrator on this for a while, and I literally used to have a external disk drive that I had loaded up with lots of SF software. Whenever we would get a new workstation in, and particularly we're using Sun machines, I would plug that disk drive in and immediately wipe out most of the software from Sun and put on what we were downloading for free off the internet. And so cost wasn't the issue there. It was just better software, and I love this. And I actually began working in that world some myself. I contributed back to Bison, the parser generator that the Free Software Foundation puts out, to create a version of it to work with C++. At the time, most of my work was in C++. And I was amazed when I put the software out there, the number of people that came back and some of them were pretty vocal. No, you've done this wrong. It should be this way. But then they'd send me the patches. And I'd realize I could just go, if I just fell on my sword, I said, oh, you're right, great. They would send me more patches. And they would send me more modifications. And it was really interesting. I learned an immense amount about C++ and parser generators by letting other people do the work for me in building that piece of software. And I thought it was a fascinating dynamic, and really enjoyed sort of the contributions from that. So by the early 90s, I began to realize that there was a sea change going on here, in particular around what we were doing with Sun workstations in an academic environment. I could see that there was very little reason for us to keep using Sun, and I thought this is going to be a problem for Sun. You've got Intel hardware coming down the pipe, which frankly is better, faster hardware. But we keep using Sun because we really love the software that's available. And yet I can see in the open internet community the path coming down the pipe that says, look, we're going to have all of this software available in source code form for free. Well, around 92, 93, the two came together when Linus now had released Linux for about a year and a half to 2 years. Linux had reached the point where it was viable as the kernel of an operating system. And I could see the two coming together. I began putting them together for our own use. People saw the combination of things, and they could look at my desk now and say, wow, that's an interesting machine you've got. I put together a Intel 486 box at the time with Linux and the whole set of software off the internet, and I had a machine that was 2.5 to 3 times faster than the Sun workstations we were buying, and of course it cost me a third the price. People thought that was fantastic. I started a little business putting those systems together for people. That turned into VA Linux, and I raised, 3 or 4 years later, I was doing that full time. Raised some venture financing and launched that company with an IPO in 1999. But that's the sort of genesis of the idea for that company. So I've been working on free and open source for a long time. Around 1999, a group of us got together, including Eric Raymond, who I think you've talked to previously, and we realized that calling the software free software was creating confusion in people's minds. That is, they automatically assumed that there was no way to charge, or there could be no charge around that software, when in fact many of us were building businesses that were taking the software for free off the internet and providing support. In our case, we were providing hardware, providing a whole platform based around the software. But the term free was confusing people in the business world. And we said, look, the real importance here is that you have a set of rights around what you can do with the software. You have the right to modify it. You have the right to source code. You can redistribute that source code. You can make your own changes, patches, etc. You can fork that code. So based upon a set of definitions that Bruce Perens had developed for Debian, we coined the term open source. And the OSI was formed, the Open Source Initiative. Eric formed that to be able to brand licenses as compliant with this definition. So we tried to expand the ecosystem of the idea of this beyond just the GPL and software that came from the Free Software Foundation. And so I'm very proud of that whole thing. I mean, I think it's obviously been a huge impact on the industry. So that's a little of my background.
Now, you currently work with a variety of businesses. Are they all based on free and open source software?
Pretty much. What I've done since I left VA Linux, now VA Software, in the middle, I think August of 2002, what I've really enjoyed is helping entrepreneurs get started and launch their businesses. And simply because of my background and my passion for open source, virtually everything I've been involved with has been related to open source. And for your listeners, I'll kind of go down the list. I work with ZenSource, open source company around virtualization, Pentaho, which does an open source business intelligence platform, Hyperic, open source systems management, Sugar CRM, an open source customer relationship management piece of software, Compere, open source ERP, Finality, which Finality is closer to my old VA Linux business. It's an appliance based around VoIP. It's a VoIP PBX appliance based around the open source Asterisk software, and then MedSphere, which is a company in the electronic healthcare space based around a piece of software that's released public domain, a little bit broader than open source, same concept though, from the federal government called Vista. So if you look at the whole list of things, everyone I'm involved with now is working somehow with open source.
Of that list that you've described, the one I think that we expect to see having an impact on schools is the VoIP or asterisk technology. We see limited adoption right now, but we see a really compelling business case for schools in moving that direction. And we think it's still some time off, but do think that's actually going to have a pretty significant impact for schools because they do have a pretty substantial telephone budget.
Oh, and if you look, the features you can get around that platform are just amazing. I spent a number of years in the telecom space. I used to work at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey before I came back out here to Stanford. And I tell you, it amazes me. That was an industry. You talk about an industry that's been very closed. You used to have to buy everything from one vendor, and everything meant, the hardware, right, the phones. So if you were to build out, a PBX system before, typically you had to buy the phones, you had to buy the switch, and of course all the software that ran on that switch all came from one vendor. And what we're seeing today is, you can buy IP phones from dozens of vendors now. The hardware is standard Intel platform hardware. I can get that from HP, Dell, IBM, or any of several dozen white box vendors. And of course, the software is open source. Finality, we run a community project called TrixBox, which is the leading, I would call it asterisk distribution out there, but it's fantastic. We give people an ISO image, they can drop in. Very, very quickly, in 10 minutes, be up and running a full-blown PBX that has all the features of these multi-$100,000 PBX systems. I think it's just an amazing, amazing thing what's been produced there, and certainly hope that all the educational institutions out there will take advantage of it.
I do think that's going to happen, and it will be fun to watch that take place because I think it's an example of the commoditization of software where exactly what you've described gets broken down, that everybody has purchased systems that are very proprietary, and the investment is enormous. And the opportunity to move away from that and to have some choice and competition will make a huge difference.
I'll tell you, the thing I love about what's happening in the industry with opening up of software like this and the breaking down of those proprietary systems is the empowerment it brings to the end users. And I think this is great in an academic setting. Where frankly, in an academic setting, you tend to have a lot of people that have more time than money, right? I certainly remember my years as a graduate student, right? I certainly had more. I don't know, I had a lot of time, but I certainly had more time than I had money because I had no money. And I loved working on those things. And I was always so empowered by having access to the code and being able to build my own things. I mean, that creativity that's enabled by open source software, I think, is the most powerful thing. You go back and you think about the kinds of software we write today and how hard it was to write that software 20 years ago because you had to start so much from scratch. Whereas today there's so much available that I can build on. I mean, it's what's enabling the whole internet revolution right now, Web 2.0. There's an immense basis to build off of. But, I remember one very defining experience, and for me personally, and in some ways it's a small thing, but in other ways, it's just personally for me, it's just a very defining moment. In the early days of VA Linux, we used QuickBooks as our accounting software. We were a small business with 5 people. There certainly wasn't an array of, today we have ERP systems on open source. We certainly didn't have that choice then. But we were running QuickBooks. And I had, of course, the whole office networked and such. And I remember one day we had set up a network printer, and every time we tried to print to that printer from QuickBooks, QuickBooks would crash. So, being the hacker, system administrator, I was the guy who was trying to track this down. And I remember, playing with different things, and eventually I figured out that if the network printer name were 11 characters or less, it worked, and if it were greater than 11 characters, it crashed. Well, if you recall, DOS had 8 plus 3 character file names, 11 characters. And the programmer in me immediately could see everything. Oh, I see it. This piece of software's got a fixed length buffer. It can store 11 characters because it came from the DOS world. It thinks that, printers can only have an 11-character name. And if it gets longer than that, it just overwrites a piece of memory and crashes the software. No problem. I can fix this, right? But, of course, it's QuickBooks. I don't have the code. So I called up tech support at Intuit. And literally, hours on the phone with people at tech support, I couldn't convince anyone that I had found a real bug in the system, nor could I convince anyone to file this as an issue, right? The most frustrating experience. And the reason was, their response was, well, we don't support the software in a networked environment. And I can see in the code the problem. I can see what needs to be fixed, but I can't get the company that controls the code to even listen to me about where they have a problem. And with open source, that feeling of frustration goes away, right? Even if you are not the author of the code, even if you are not a developer, there are plenty of people you can find who understand code and will understand the piece of software enough that you are not, you do not run into a wall with these kinds of issues that you can with proprietary software. So, I think if you talk to anybody in the open source space, they will all have for you, some examples of their personal experiences where proprietary software failed for them, and they realized the power of open source.
I think what's interesting to me about your story is that even though I'm not a programmer who could have figured out what you figured out, and likely most of our listeners won't be, what it does point up is the fascinating way in which individuals want to solve problems and then want to contribute. And it helps to define and explain the nature of building of open source software by a community, lots of times of volunteers, that you would have been very excited to have helped solve that problem for them. And we're willing to put in several hours to try and help them solve it so that you could have a better system, partly just because it was intriguing and enjoyable to have solved it.
I think something that has gone on here for a number of years is that software companies for a long time assumed that their audience didn't want to be involved with them as a company, right? And they also assumed that their audience wasn't intelligent. They didn't give their users credit. If you talk to most people who use a system and use a software, even if they're not someone who's a developer and can write code, they actually care, about that piece of software they use, and they would be thrilled to be engaged in a dialogue with the company about it. Even if it's just a discussion about how they use it and what features would make it better or what ways of interaction with the software would help them do their job, every user tends to develop this kind of passion around the software they work with. I don't know if I go that far, every user, but there's a large group of people that care, and I don't think for a long time software companies understood that, and I think they distanced themselves from those people, and many people became very frustrated as a result. And this is not just developers, not just people who write code, but users in general. The experience of buying and using software became very, very frustrating for people. And I think open source is changing some of that.
I can remember personally I used Microsoft Access quite extensively for a long period of time. And I can almost remember a shift. There was a time when I could actually call and speak to an engineer at Microsoft. And it was so fun to be using a desktop relational database. And it was so exciting for me. And I did discover things that were bugs. in Access in one version. I can remember actually getting through and talking to a person and feeling like I was heard, and then knowing that there was going to be value or improvement in the product. And then at some point, it just seemed as though I could never get through to somebody after that.
Well, and you were providing, companies lost track of the site that you were providing a valuable resource to them, right? First of all, you were a customer, but I'm sure if other people asked you, you said, oh, yes, I use Access. Here, I'd recommend it, and here's how I'd use it. But also, you were on the phone with them, willing to invest your time to explain to them where there was a problem and help them understand how to find it, right? That has value, and I think companies lost sight of that, but the open source world understands it, and there are ways for people to contribute beyond just writing code that include features, bugs, documentation, all of those pieces. And something I've been working with for a number of years now is that whole model we've had around proprietary software it's just been broken because of how we treat our customers.
Well, and it also seems as though the advent of the internet, the history of the free and open source software movement have both helped combine to create just a new reality in the way that we do things. The ability to collaborate so effectively through the internet is dramatically changing all kinds of businesses. I've for a couple of years now, I've used the American Idol TV show as an example, but Doc Searles didn't like that, and I've stopped using it. But the idea that the audience participates in the creation of the product is a huge thing, facilitated by the internet, and really transforming, I think, business in general.
I think enabling people, the users, to create content is. I think the open source movement is one example of that larger movement. I think you're exactly right there. And while Doc may not like that example, I can understand why he doesn't like that example. The concept is very much true, and that is the internet, and the internet has empowered people who were previously known only as consumers of content to become producers of content. I think that were previously they wanted to be producers. They were previously frustrated producers because they didn't have a distribution mechanism for what they wanted to produce. People are incredibly creative, and we should, there's a great phrase, innovation happens elsewhere, right? What that means is we should never underestimate the creativity of other people. And sometimes, even in Hollywood, there's this tendency to say, okay, we're the people that know how to create something. The same is true in the software world. We're the elitists. We know how to develop the software. We know better than you, right? You get that ivory tower, what Eric wrote about in the cathedral and the bazaar. You get that cathedral that says we know it better than you do. And the internet has enabled the rest of the world to say, well, that's fine. You go off in your cathedral. We're going to go work together and build something that's great because we are creative, we are smart. And the internet enables us to have the communication mechanism to do that. I tell you that along this line, the number one challenge for media companies out there today on the internet is user-generated content. I mean, people aren't switching from, CBS, NBC, and ABC over to cable channels. I mean, they are. But I tell you where they're going. They're going to YouTube, right? They're going online. They're going to user-generated content on the internet. That's the big challenge for people's attention if you're in the big media company space. And it's that feeling of empowerment, the feeling of personal creativity. It is the same in the open source software world. We just happen to be creating software and instead of creating videos on YouTube. But it's the same idea. It's the same idea.
Let me, if I can, shift this a little bit back toward the schools and kind of draw some of these thoughts back toward the academic environment. One area in which there is a fair amount of excitement right now is the use of read-write web technologies in the classroom. And of course, that scares a lot of teachers and administrators because there are certainly some very real dangers associated with it. But it does seem that the ability to generate content and have it be peer-reviewed or looked at by others and to get feedback is enormously powerful. I know personally I feel that my life is significantly enhanced by being able to blog. And the stories from the teachers are that students who participate in blogging, even at an early age, get much more excited about reading and writing and communicating. And I think what's interesting to me is that they will meet some resistance with regard to that. But I also don't see any real use of or any real teaching of collaborative software building in K-12 schools. Have you seen anything like that? The example I use is that Apache is just such an incredibly popular program in the business world, and yet it seems it's virtually untaught in schools.
That's interesting. So I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I can tell you anything which involves an opportunity for her to interact with her other friends is very easy to get her to do. And she will go online on the computer in various ways and interact. If she can interact with other kids and play games with other kids, she loves that. I think enabling kids to learn through those mechanisms is very powerful. And I can readily see how encouraging her writing skills through some kind of shared peer mechanism via whether it's blogging in the classroom or whatever could be a great way to encourage her to learn and develop. It's interesting, but at the same time, there's certainly not sort of the collaborative software learning skills, certainly in what I would call K through 12. But I tell you, as you step into colleges, I think there are a fair number of colleges now that use collaborative software development techniques to begin teaching, or as they teach programming, and that is peer programming is an important part of that process today. And I've seen a fair number of schools now that teach and encourage development of software in groups because that's the way software is truly built in the world today. And they use things like SourceForge when doing that. So there are schools that use SourceForge. The other person, I don't know if you've had a chance to interview him, Brian Bellendorf, who's one of the founders of the Apache project and Chief Technical Officer over at CollabNet. Brian also, I think, has some very good examples of this as well. But I think that more and more, at least at the college level in education, you are seeing collaborative software development taught. That is, we're going to work together in a group to build a particular piece of software, and we're going to use Internet-style open tools to build that. And our peers are going to be able to see what we're doing. Because that truly is the way software is being built today. Even if it's internal within a company and the visibility is just internal within a company, not to the rest of the world, it's the way people want to build software today because it's producing better software. So I see it more and more, at least at the college level.
And that's probably pretty encouraging because my guess is that as colleges do that, it will trickle down and have an impact on what's taught in high school. I mean, it's been one of the interesting themes that I've seen coming into the open source world, relatively new, is that there's a huge opportunity to really provide tangible skills to, say, upper-level high school students in computer classes by teaching them open source software that just seems to be being lost. But if the colleges do it, then my guess is that the high schools will start to do it to prepare the students for college.
Yeah, I think it will trickle down there. The the thing that I find interesting, most of the kids I see in high school who do this stuff tend to be doing it on their own. I don't think that it's made it into the classroom yet. But open source is such an empowering mechanism for them, because the way they learned to do it on their own was looking at other people's code. Right? They went out on the internet and they said, "Wow, that particular piece of software, whatever, is cool." They downloaded it. They looked at the code, and that's how they learned, and that inspired them. And so, open source is clearly inspiring a generation at the high school level. I don't see that it's made it into the curriculum yet. I don't see that it's made it into the teaching techniques yet, right? But I do see that the individuals have spotted it, and I think it's only a matter of time before you get into that level where you're teaching it in the high schools. And one of the methods of teaching is start with something that's free and open source. I mean, there's so many possibilities there. I mean, I used to lecture at Stanford, and I can imagine giving these assignments that involve taking an existing piece of code and making some minor modifications to it, because that teaches you so much, and the results are so tangible. And one of the problems with teaching software is that you want people, want to feel reward for what they create. The feedback cycle needs to be short. You need to be able to make small, tangible changes and see the results, and it's hard to do if you're starting from scratch. Whereas with open source, we can start with something that's there, make a small change, and see a very tangible result, and that's a very important positive feedback mechanism in teaching.
Well, one point that Doc Searles made that has really resonated with me is that the open source world is really populated with people who are self-learners. That high school student who learns about open source software and participates, independent of what's happening in his actual high school experience, has really become a self-learner. And that there is sort of a fundamental change that is taking place with regard to our understanding of learning and promoting it that may be a little bit at odds with our traditional way of educating. So, if the open source movement and the collaborative movements are really about self-learning, then the whole nature of how we view the classroom it changes.
Well, as usual, Doc is very much right there. There's an awful lot of self-learning in open source. In particular, you have to be the kind of person who can pick up these new techniques and learn them. And one of my hopes is that in the educational institutions, that around software and programming, we are teaching people how to learn, and we are not teaching them specific computer languages or skills. One of the things that frustrates me is when you run across someone who is a programmer, developer, has particular skills around a language, whether it's Java or C# or whatever, and what they've learned is they know how to write Java code. They don't actually know how to write computer code. They don't understand computer languages. And I think that that's a disservice to be teaching people just at that level. And what we need to teach them is, okay, here is how languages work. Here is the example we're learning in Java. But these are skills that you should be able to apply to C, C#, Ruby, Python, Perl, on and on down the list in different ways in different environments, right? Now, you're only going to become an expert in each of those if you spend a lot of time practicing. Practicing in this world is coding in those languages. But your skills should be transferable, and you should be able to self-learn and transfer those skills from one to another. And I think there's still too much computer education and training that's focused on, say, language-specific or software-specific skills, and not on the general how do I learn new software, new languages, new applications.
Very interesting. For the sake of understanding open source software in schools, we've kind of divided it into three categories. One being administrative programming uses, what would be considered back office or infrastructure.
Okay.
Open source in education, meaning the use of programs that might otherwise be proprietary but are just a part of the normal course of education, like OpenOffice or Firefox web browser, replacing proprietary programs. And then the third being, open source as education, which is that third piece of teaching programming or teaching collaborative techniques or teaching, how to learn. And the third is obviously one that's very interesting and very exciting, but oftentimes teachers and schools are looking for very practical answers for right now. So one of the things that we think that we've identified is that the open source community has typically had difficulty approaching administrators in terms of the conversion to free and open source software. And that's not that surprising, because decisions at the high administrative level often involve a fair amount of money. There's fairly active marketing to them by proprietary companies, and they're also hesitant to do something that's unique and different.
Right.
And then the other thing that happens is that there will often be a fair amount of evangelizing by members of the community to individual teachers. Use Linux in your classroom or use these free and open source software programs. And what we think we've identified there is that for the average teacher, the burden of their regular duties, interacting with parents, helping the students, getting to know each student, preparing regular lessons, is heavy enough that while you'll have some small percentage of sort of early adopters or those who are willing to stay up late and learn new things, for most teachers, Linux and free and open source software are not actually any easier for them to learn or to use than the proprietary programs.
Right.
And so, so in some ways, one of the things we're searching for is a better understanding of how to help schools become aware of and use free and open source software, because both at the teacher level and then at the district level, it's hard to figure out how to be effective in helping make that transformation.
Yeah, that take out the idea that we're talking about education in general, and you see those same kinds of issues coming up in sort of the commercial business world, not just in the education world, right? And you see the same kinds of questions coming up. I think part of the advantage here is in education. I do think that sort of third element you talked about can be a driving factor, which is open source, I believe, enables us to teach certain concepts that I think are otherwise harder to teach. And that, I think, is a leverage point over some of the proprietary alternatives. I don't know how much of a leverage point it is, but I think it's something that we can look at here and say, if you are teaching, for example, computer skills, the opportunity for you to sort of dig inside and let your students get more hands-on and sort of self-empower is there with open source, and it's typically not there with the proprietary alternatives. Right? So there are things you can teach your students that become more lifelong skills, that become more about how to teach themselves and how to learn these kinds of computer skills that transcend a particular piece of software. I mean, we don't want to teach people to use Microsoft Word, right? We want to teach people to do is sort of online use of word processing, and whether they use OpenOffice or Word or something else is going to change over time, because the preferred particular medium over time is going to change, right? And I think using open source software is more conducive to enabling them to learn the how to learn and the how to transfer their skills than if they're stuck in one particular proprietary system. And that's because open source allows them to typically dig inside more, get inside more, and hopefully the teachers will, if this is where they're teaching, they'll begin to develop lesson plans and curricula that give the students the opportunity to understand more what's going on within these systems rather than just the mechanics of, how do I do a particular thing in this piece of software.
What do you think the impact of Web 2.0 technologies is going to be on open source software? And in some ways, I see people adopting Web 2.0 technologies very fast, and where otherwise an open source software tool might be used, because it's so accessible and the results are so immediate.
Give me some examples, or give me a little more focused what you mean by that.
Okay, so blogging.
Yes.
A lot of the tools that are being used for blogging are have their roots in open source software, but are not actually open source. Blogger from Google is a great example. It's very easy to use, very, very quick to get an account and start blogging, but it's not actually an open source tool.
Right. And I think that you see, though, those things have their roots in open source, and I don't think we would have those kinds of tools if it weren't for open source. So I almost turn it around and say those tools are their existence is dependent on a vibrant open source ecosystem, and I would almost argue the whole existence of Web 2.0 in general has been enabled by open source. Without open source, we wouldn't have that. And so for me, I look at that as a shining example of how open source can enable innovation, and then turn that around and say, look, you want to be enabling your students to understand how to use and create those kinds of tools. I think there needs to be some understanding of their history, where they came from, how they were created, and to me that opens the door to open source.
I think a really good example of that is Google. And interestingly enough, I think you've brought that point out very well. Clearly Google, oftentimes the question is asked in a funny way. How many people in the audience have used Linux?
Right.
And I've heard different speakers say this, and then 2 or 3 people raise their hand. They'll say, "How many of you use Google?" And everybody will raise their hands and say, "Well, you've been using Linux because Google is built on all these Linux servers."
Yes.
So, and I have noticed Google's commitment to their Summer of Code program, and,
right,
and their commitment to Linux and open source software, and so maybe that is the answer. Although from the standpoint of the average user and their general everyday use, it does seem as though Web 2.0 is beginning to have such power in terms of users being able to interact.
Right.
That in many ways, Tim O'Reilly may be right when he says, what we really need now is an evangelist like Richard Stallman who says, okay, I'm using Web 2.0 technologies, but I don't actually own the data. I put all my photos up on Flickr. I put in all this metadata.
Right. And
I don't actually own it, and I need to be able to own it because it's important for me to have ownership of that content.
Yes. But things like Google, I think, are so inspirational to people. And you look at students, and Chris DeBona over at Google's the gentleman who runs that Summer of Code and director of open source, though, and Chris over there. And Chris is a fantastic person. If you get a chance, you should talk to him. You should have him on this show, but on this podcast. Chris is fantastic, and Chris has done an amazing amount to promote and push and support open source from what he's done at Google. And I think you look at things like Google, and they become an inspiration for everyone who wants to understand how to create something like that. I mean, Google, YouTube, these are all examples of Web 2.0 properties that have been created by leveraging open source in a huge way, and without a lot of need for armies of programmers. I mean, small numbers of people can create this stuff very quickly, and that's very inspirational. To the idea about content and who owns content and owning your data, I think Tim has got a very good point. What you're seeing in a lot of these companies is they're sort of getting out of the notion that what's important is the code that runs their system. That's not what's important. What's important is the data that's in there, and the data has value, and the code doesn't have value anymore, right? The code.
Well, it changes the lock-in mechanism.
It changes the lock-in mechanism. That's right. The lock-in mechanism is around your data. It's not around the fact that these guys happen to have a piece of software that no one else has, right? And I do think people need to stand up and take a stand on allowing their data to be locked in. I mean, if you can't get your data out of a system, what is it, the Roach Motel of websites, right? Your data can go in, but it can't come out. What's the? I think Tim's used that analogy before, even. What is the point of that? I mean, people need to realize that is a problem for them, and it's going to be a problem for all of us. So Tim is right in that sense, and people are using that data as lock-in now instead of using software as lock-in, and we as users are people are going to have to realize that and go to those places where they own their own data, right?
Well, and that does seem to be very much the open source solution, which is, now somebody needs to create a similar service that says, we'll make sure that you have your data. And customers like me will say, hey, it's important to me to own my own data because all that family history information I put on my old family history photographs, I really can't afford to have it be locked into one place.
Well, and I'll give you a commercial example of that. I'm an investor and on the board of a company, Sugar CRM, which built a customer relationship management tool, CRM tool.
We use it here.
Okay, great. So probably the largest competitor for Sugar CRM is Salesforce, right? One of the reasons why customers move from Salesforce to Sugar is the fact that on Salesforce, which is a hosted ASP model, Salesforce owns your data, right? If you leave Salesforce, Salesforce doesn't have to delete your data. Now, customers get very uncomfortable with that, particularly when it's all their, it's all their customer lists, it's all that data. They want to own it. They want to make sure that it's not out there in the cloud, going to someone else or, who knows what's happening to it, right? They want to own it. They want to bring that back in-house. That's one of the things that has led people to move from Salesforce to Sugar.
And I think Sugar's a really good example of another aspect of open source software that we can draw back to schools again, which is in terms of their administrative computing.
Yes.
We used Goldmine for years.
Right.
And one of the things that it was always uncomfortable for me was every 9 to 12 months, things would happen. They would upgrade the version, and we would have to not only upgrade our version of Goldmine, but we'd have to upgrade our hardware. And we felt very much out of control. That process was never in our control, and the financial ramifications of it were never ones that we could plan for.
Got it.
And so switching to Sugar CRM really meant we were now in control.
Yes.
We could say, okay, we don't want to upgrade right now. We're going to wait a year, and it's not going to impact our support. It's not going to impact, we're not going to, we're not going to have a problem then call and say, well, you have to upgrade in order to get support. It really it's very interesting. Some of it's just emotional relief of not feeling that somebody else is dictating your decision-making in that area.
Mm-hmm.
We really do like Sugar CRM, and I'll give it a plug, although I don't think many schools will actually end up using it. It is a great program, and I think it exemplifies some of the best aspects of commercial open source. I promised you an hour interview.
Yes.
And I'm sensitive to that. I'd like to ask you one more question. Do you have time for one quick question?
Please.
Okay. So one of the things that we're noticing, at least in the schools, is that the Bill Gates, the Gates Foundation, and Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, recent partnership in terms of, providing funds for schools, would appear to be something that will have a pretty dramatic impact on schools and decision making over the next 25 years.
Uh-huh.
And in South Africa, Mark Shuttleworth has been sort of a vocal proponent of the use of open source software in schools, and has put his foundation and some of his resources behind that.
Yes.
We've been interested that there really hasn't been anything in the United States like that. There hasn't been a company or an individual to kind of stand up and say, I really want to support open source in education. What do you think would have to happen for that to take place? What could I do individually, and what could others in the open source movement do to help create an environment where we could bring people? And I'm not putting you on the spot, certainly, because that's not my intention at all. But let's say that we wanted to create some involvement of business leaders.
We need more Mark Shuttleworths in the U.S.
Well, what do we need? What do we need to get the open source business people involved in the educational community? And again, I'm not asking you personally, but just a general question.
Sure.
What do we do, and how how could we go about trying to get some of that same kind of involvement, so to raise the visibility of open source?
If you look in some ways, let's take the philanthropic movements that's driving some of this, right? In particular, if you look at Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, you're really looking at sort of people that are reaching the end of their careers and turning their attentions to philanthropy, right? And I mention that because I think timing is important here. In business, in many of these endeavors, there's kind of a natural development time frame for these things to build out, and I think part of the problem here is that we're still in the, frankly, early generations of open source, and education, for better or worse, is not one of those areas that the early proponents of a movement tend to turn to in the beginning, right? So there's kind of this evolution. I think we're moving more and more into that phase where you'll see more effort begin to go there, and more of the kinds of initiatives that you talk about begin to develop. But it's sort of this natural progression that I think one of the solutions here is just we have to be patient, and things will develop over time. So that's kind of my first comment here, right? I think we're still in the early stages, and I think that's part of the reason you don't see as much of that emphasis. So it's sort of an explanation, and then an assertion that if we're patient, we will begin to see more of those. So that's one thing. But the second thing is, I do think that we as a community in open source have to do a much better job of getting the message out there of the value to educational institutions, and also the value in teaching. I mean, I would almost really rather sell to the teacher who's in the classroom, and teach that, help that person understand how they can use and teach open source techniques and methods to use it to educate their students, but also better prepare their students for a new generation, a new world here where everything happens online. The internet is immensely important. Being certainly a somewhat computer savvy and technically empowered is going to become critical for people in the future. You have to begin teaching those things, and open source is going to enable teaching those things. So rather than go for the administrative sides of things, or in the educational tools, I'd almost rather go in and say the techniques. You need to know these things. I mean, you're growing up in a world where, Google is a verb that everyone knows, right? Where all the people you know are Googleable. I can look them up on the internet. I can find them.
I don't think we're allowed to say that anymore. Right? Didn't Google say that we're not allowed to use the word as a verb?
Well, they can say what they want, but to me,
I certainly do all the time.
To me, when your name has been turned into a verb, you've arrived. Okay, so
Xerox, Google.
Exactly. So that's to me, look. You have to be teaching students to live in this world. And it's a world that's built on open source. And I think teaching professionals, once they realize and understand that, are going to realize that, look, we have to be teaching these concepts of open source software to kids in the classroom, because they are going to need those skills to survive in the next generation here. And to me, that is a message that we have to get out there more. And, hopefully, things like this interview will help to get that message out there.
Larry, that's a great way to finish. I really want to thank you for your time, and I want to thank you, personally, just for your involvement and your commitment to the open source software movement and all that you've done for that.
Great, Steve. Thank you. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be on here, and very much appreciate. I've been lucky enough to be in position here where, I've just been around some great people, hopefully been able to contribute in my own way. But again, thanks for the opportunity to come on here and speak.
No, thank you.